almost a trend to describe them as a new normal, what is in our relationship. And the new normal doesn't mean that it's something very normal and something very positive, but it is a new normal. As last year in Riga Dialogue, we even discussed the risks of unmanaged confrontation. This year it seems that the biggest hope is that we can still have a managed confrontation. The neighborhood, which is of course indispensable, which is overlapping space in many ways, which has interest from many sides, of course including the neighborhood itself. As Carl Bildt was saying, it's rather a ring of fire than ring of friends. So it's a ring of fire on the east to a large extent and also on the south. As for us, there is a silver lining, and I repeat it for many occasions, that of course we are a stable and safe region, it seems, and Warsaw decisions, NATO decisions have contributed strongly to it. But I remember also words by Robert Kaplan when he says that it's end of post-historical nirvana for the region. We saw that history and geopolitics have ended here. Now they have not ended, they continue. So there is basically a continuation of clash and interaction of different interests. So this provides quite a challenging environment, but at the same time still this event, what is already an annual event for us, the Riga Dialogue, when we try to have a diversity of opinions. We have 16 countries in this Riga Dialogue this year, even though at the table we have a little bit less. So it is about willingness and at least identification of opportunities to reconnect on some of the issues, if not all of this. And of course, also the partnerships are important, partnerships among the countries and institutions, also partnerships among those institutions which have supported us. Some of you, I mean not some of you, all of you can see them on the slides, so I think I will not even repeat here. So I go directly to the panel. We have an excellent panel of speakers. Artyom Malgin, who is a pro-rector at MGIMO, pretty much university which prepares diplomats. Not only diplomats, but I mean diplomats is a very important element, economists as well, yes. We have Ambassador Alexander Charly, who was a former first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and also part of the OSCE Eminent Persons panel. So there is Russian perspective, there is Ukrainian perspective. We have Mr. Karsten Voigt, who was a former German American coordinator and been very actively involved in politics in Germany, but also international politics of Germany. And we have Dr. Margarita Sheshelgita, who is a studies director of Institute of International Relations Political Science of Vilnius University. So we have a quite wide spectrum representation of different positions, I hope so. And Artyom, we can start immediately with you. Yes, Russia is the reason why we are basically here.
Okay,
and discussing.
I
so
can
is it
start, but I see no logic because we can choose either the...
Artyom, the logic is you are first in a
Okay,
program.
your logic because you are
Let's
organizing.
go with that one. So let's start. Is it time to reconnect? Let's go for that, please.
Okay, first of all, I guess we've never left each other. We've never been disconnected, but these connections gradually happen to be more and more strange, difficult, and dangerous, and even poisonous for both Russia and the West, as well for an outer world, because these poisonous connections, very adversary connections, they really spoil cooperation with third parties involved in Russia's foreign policy, as well as the foreign policy of European countries or the United States. And very often our counterparts, they should choose what position to take, with whom to ally, and I guess it's rather uncomfortable. Second, I want to say that both outcome and reason for these strange connections, misunderstanding, all this turmoil, let's put it in a mild way, is Ukraine. We can talk about Syria whatsoever, but Ukraine is a main and glaring point. Ukraine symbolizes ability / disability of Russia and West to cooperate, to interact simply in this common neighborhood. Ukraine tried to bring this idea once before 2013 to 2014. It was this Orange Revolution. But we've taken no lessons, both of us, Russia and the West, from this revolution. That it's really a big country, and the situation in this country, when it goes wrong, could contaminate the relations between West and Russia, could change the whole situation in the European continent, and that this country is a country in itself. Yeah? Orange Revolution somehow digested itself. And in the year 2004, no one could imagine further, after 2005, 6, 7, different coalitions within Ukrainian politics. And do remember how Russia and West at that time both were involved, harshly, emotionally involved into this situation. Unfortunately, this Orange Revolution ended in a kind of balance in Ukraine. Fragile, probably not a very optimal balance, but still. And then a new turning point happened. And both Russia and the West happened to be, I don't want to use the word guilty, but somehow happened to be unprepared for the next portion of changes in this crucial country. This third, we also have not learned one more lesson. It's the lesson of the year 2008 of Georgian Ossetian conflict. I'm not going to be much into details of this conflict, who is guilty, who started the first, but the conflict showed that it's not in wild 90s, that it's not somewhere in distant from us, Middle East or even the Balkans, but it's contemporary Europe or nearly Europe, it depends. Military conflicts and military means of dealing with the conflict are possible. And these two lessons, which stayed unlearned, brought to the situation of the year 2013, 2014. Fourth, how we can reconnect. Now I guess the framework for this reconnection is, let's say, very loose, general, but at the same time natural. What I mean, we have common interests, and most of these interests, they come from the sphere of global economy, finance, general order, and the framework for this reconnection is global economic regime, international financial flows, international investments, and all these institutions, and very often regimes, because they're milder than traditional political institutions, that are common for both of us still. I mean, for Russia and the West. Unfortunately, so-called common political interests, even those we got used to perceive as common, or at least as we perceived as common, let us say, 15 years ago. Now they look a little bit banal, or probably we're much more familiar with them, and even terrorist attacks, potential of those who already happened, they don't frighten anymore, let us say, in a positive way. Let's say they don't consolidate anymore. Do remember our perception of terror in the year 2001 and nowadays. Nowadays, we've learned to pick up those who are relatively good guys, or those who could be good guys after a few, let us say, pedagogical exercises. Those who could be somehow converted to, let us say, more reliable position of those with whom we could, and here I guess position of both parties or all parties involved, it's like this. It's not any more perception of terror as something absolutely alien to the world of civilized countries, which is really consolidated, as it was under Bush and President Putin at that time, at the beginning of the previous decade. So, again, only these very loose but natural global interests, they could be interests which could consolidate us back. Then, do we need each other? I guess, yeah. We need, because of these interests which I've already encountered. Do we need each other when it comes to, let us say, more narrow definition of West? Because United States, much distant from Europe, and Russia in this sense is a European country. Our immediate interactions with the United States in sphere of economy and finance, they're nearly at a zero level. That is why when I ask whether we need each other, Russia and the EU, I guess yeah. Because Russia still is the greatest market, is a market which showed its stability. It showed under under the last 3 years this same culture of consumption, even under the sanctions, but partially self-imposed sanctions, but the same culture of consumption. And that is why this market is attractive. The same European economy of finance, economy of services, as well attractive to Russia, if we are not going to move North Korea away. I hope no. And it's the main understanding. Besides, Russia allies, they play a role of some kind of positive agent provocateur, positive pushers. I mean, our allies from Eurasian Economic Community, they're not ready to cut off their relations with West, neither Kazakhstan or Belarus. At the same time, they're inside Russia-led union. But this union is not led by force. It's led by common interests. Sure, since Russia is bigger, a portion, a bulk of Russian interests in this union is bigger. But still, it's a union. And Russia should listen to, should take into account position of the countries involved. And here, it's the seventh point, all potential schemes, scenarios could be invented. How to build these new relations or to build positive connection. Let's say all these changes, they're rather of internal character from both sides, including Russia, because we showed to each other that in a short time period, we could survive being divided. But it's not the best optimal way of survival.
Artyom, thank you so much for I think, providing us both constraints of being together and reconnecting, and also the opportunities. And there is still the common sense to be more reconnected in many ways. But as a moderator, I guess I have to play a little bit of devil's advocate's role here and a little bit provoke also discussion. I recently read the statements by Mr. Konstantin Kosachev, who is, of course, quite an important position in Russia. And he said there are, to put it mildly, I would use even word, three major challenges to Russia. One is extreme Islam or Islamic radicalism. Second one was about a neo-communist dictatorship of North Korea. And third one was Western liberalism as an ideology which actually is liberal jihad, what he even called. Is it, under those circumstances, if there are such perceptions, can we build really community and reconnect on values, on the basis of values, or we can reconnect just on the basis of interest in some concrete fields, more or less as we describe it as selective engagement, that there will not be community values? Artyom.
Look, I guess here the most interesting to the public is how we decipher this Western liberalism, and the question about the values somehow linked much more with this third term. I guess I know Kosachev, and I guess he means by Western liberalism this, I would say, kind of liberalism, which very often strongly opposed inside the countries of the European Union. Yeah? When this liberalism happens to be too modern, probably to be accepted by traditional societies. When it somehow moves away traditional moral frameworks, and you probably witness it here in the European Union. Look at neighboring Poland. They're also in fight with this so-called Western liberalism. They even, by a minister of foreign affairs, if I'm not mistaken, question, let's say, some of the values. Yeah? And if there is such a discussion within European Union, why not a Russian parliamentarian, because Mr. Kosachev nowadays, he is a head of Senate's Committee on Foreign Affairs, why he could not participate into this discussion. But I have no doubts that Kosachev, who is a great specialist on Northern Europe, those who was grown up in the Soviet and Russian embassies in this part of Europe, understands both wishes and good and bad sides of liberalism, and understands that liberal values, they're simply part and parcel of democratic system, and here is contradictions with, let's say, at least contradictions at the level when we could not agree about common values. I guess at least in the 1975, some values, some guidelines for all European institution, all European political regime with some hints on legal and economic reparation were made. I mean, CSCS, it was called at that time, then it has been transformed into OSCE. If our predecessors, or predecessors of our predecessors, could achieve such level of understanding, I guess, in nowadays, more closer Europe higher. Okay. We have this chance.
Artyom, thanks. I think I was not wrong, I was not mistaken when I said that you, first of all, teach and prepare excellent diplomats. You gave an excellent example of also skillful diplomatic answer, but absolutely, I think it was also expected. Alexandra, the Ukraine, as was mentioned, actually is at the core I would not say the word problem, but the core of the challenge is to reconnect. Would you agree with that one?
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, dear colleague, it's a big honor and responsibility to be today with you on fantastic event Riga Dialogue, and my special gratitude for today's discussion where Ukraine was in center and a lot of panelists to support my country. My position is not 100% position of official Ukrainian government, but as a former First Deputy Minister, I now free of any state career responsibilities, so I permit being more creative. So, to my mind, from Ukrainian strategic interests and perspectives, Russia and West reconnection, it's a very good and timely idea. And I think in nearest future we have two windows of opportunities for such strategic reconnection. This is period after election of new old Chancellor of Germany, first period, and the next period after election new old President of Russia. I think the next spring will be maybe a start of a new, very important reconciliation process between Russia and West. It's my first remarks. And second, I don't like the word reconnection, because we have reset, so reconnection, it's bad term. I prefer very successful term, which demonstrates success in previous history of Europe, détente. So let's be more brave, more strategic, with new vision. Let's speak about new détente. Why? I, from Ukraine, try to support this as idea of new détente, because I totally agree that Ukraine crisis, in more precise wording, illegal annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression in Donbass, create total disrupt, total crisis in relations between West and Russia. So I totally agree that without settlement Ukrainian crisis, I stress settlement, it will be impossible to restore neither a new European architecture or even to establish, manage confrontation relations between West and Russia. Because now, according to my clarification, we are back to the end of the 50s of the previous century. We are in a situation where exist no red lines between the West and Russia, and exist no rules how to manage existing confrontation. So, in my understanding, maybe next 6-8 months, we, in very quick period, enjoy terrible experience of establishing some kind of new Berlin Wall, and maybe next 8 months we meet some events similar to Caribbean crisis. But this is maybe two negative effects put us to be more rigid, more straight on for new détente after the election of new old Russian president. How I see the process? First of all, I totally disagree with mainstream idea of today that any dialogue with Russia possible after the implementation of Minsk agreement. Because as Ukrainian, I tell you that Minsk agreement for Ukrainian society, especially political elite, is totally dead. And I'm sure it was confirmed today that Minsk is not work. If we do preconditions that Minsk is preconditions for some dialogue, some détente with Russia, it's very unconstructive position. And this is position also very unconstructive because Minsk, it's about ceasefire. It's not about peaceful settlement. Even the primary task to establish sustainable ceasefire, Minsk not reach success. So, to my mind, we have to be more brave, more strategic, and I think that after this is re-election period, Europe receive more strategic vision leaders, and Macron in France, that we need to organize two possible events. What we like more? The first one, I prefer to start preparing a new OSCE summit, Helsinki 2, maybe with positioning in Kiev. It's detente started, the idea of detente, Bonn, Helsinki process. So let's speak about new pan-European Helsinki-Kiev process and establish 4 baskets: military security, human rights, economy, and I am sure now we need a new basket, ecology. And I am sure in such package approach, without any preconditions, maybe we spend 1 or 3 years to find a general compromise which permit us to reconstruct a new European architecture, manage confrontation architecture. If Helsinki Act we reconfirm, or maybe we will be so successful that reconfirm Paris cooperation security formula. But if somebody not prefer a new pan-European conference on security, I propose another idea: to organize pan-European conference on Ukraine, like Madrid conference on Palestine, and concentrate on pan-European format, how to find solution for Ukraine and how to find solution for European new model of security. And to my mind, we have a vision. We have to put forward now a brave idea which can give us a perspective. Because to speak only about Minsk, it's the way without any positive results in future.
Thank you, Alexander. I think for us could be quite an orthodox Ukrainian view, because of course Ukrainian side very frequently reminds that Minsk agreement is very important, but that, as you mentioned, we should look beyond the Minsk agreement, and of course there is a wider context. And I would like to share your view. I'm not so sure if I'm able to do it, but I would like to share a view about the prospects of detente between the West and Russia at some point. But can you see the opportunity now for Ukraine and Russia to have detente under those circumstances, what we see right now when still people are unfortunately and dramatically dying?
Look, you put a very concrete and right question. My answer very concrete. Separate Ukrainian, Russian detente impossible, because Ukrainian crisis is consequences of geopolitical and geoeconomic war between West and Russia, between EU and Russia, NATO and Russia over the Ukraine. So it's a trick. You both are playing with us. As a Ukrainian former diplomat who can tell honestly, the Ukrainian nation wants you to conclude peace over Ukraine and to help us to restore our territorial integrity and to restore our total sovereignty. And a special responsibility from West and from Russia, because you are both guarantee our territorial integrity. According with Budapest Memorandum, I was one of architecture of this document, and I participated in Budapest during the signing of this document. And it's a very important document with a very important insurance, because he directly connected with non-proliferation, not in Ukrainian case, in global case. Neither Northern Korea, neither Iran never believe any deals if the country who gave up the set nuclear weapons in the world receive finally disintegration and problems with territorial integrity. So to my mind, we have to synchronize your detente in Europe and improvement of relations between Ukraine and Russia. It's possible only in synchronized manner. And concerning the Minsk, I am not telling that Minsk not necessary. I am only telling that no alternative exist only on cemetery. In real life, alternative exist in every possibility. So it's my message. And another question, when you are telling about Ukrainian position, you follow the statements which Ukrainian state people are doing abroad. But if you read Ukrainian papers inside or follow the debate in parliament, or even statement of the same politician who do some statements abroad concerning the Minsk inside of the country, you see that for Ukrainian political elite, Minsk practically dead.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Then we move forward. Karsten, you've been observer of the interaction between Russia and the West already for years, and you've been also part of our Riga dialogue already for years. So you come here and you can observe which direction actually we go. Are we moving direction of deterrent? Are we moving direction of reconnecting with each other? Are we moving direction of solving those very delicate issues, for instance, as dealing with Ukraine? Or we are still having quite an impasse under those circumstances, what we see right now? Please.
We are in the phase in which we try to define our interests, our concepts, and try to discover whether there are possibilities of compromise between the Russian concept and the Western concept. And there I'm not clear yet. And therefore, because I want to be provocative, I would summarize the headline of my remarks under the title, Germany, Russia, and the European Order. This is what many people fear in this region. And I will concentrate especially on those nations west of Russia and east from Germany, including Ukraine. And first, independent of who will be elected as Chancellor after the next German election, I think what I'm describing is not the former position of the German government, but whoever is elected, this basic position will not change, in my view. And this is that we have a vested interest in an improvement of the relationship between Russia and its Western neighbors. Because it would make our relationship with Russia much easier. Because there's always a certain degree of suspicion if Germans have a good relationship with Russia in the neighborhood. Many people are saying that in Russia that the origin of the crisis is the behavior of the West. And many people in the West are saying that the origin of the crisis is the authoritarian development inside Russia. I have a third explanation, not alternative to the two, but in addition to the two. I think one element of the present crisis which we have in Europe, in this region, is that Russia, after 1991, has not developed a constructive relationship with its Western neighbors, especially with the smaller neighbors. And this is understandable. Russia, it's not only Russia's fault. I think it's primarily Russia's fault, but anyhow, it's a fact. And one of the effects, the result of this effect was the war in Georgia and Ukraine. I think Russia, which is explaining it primarily as a result of the deterioration of the relationship with the United States. And this is already an element of the crisis, because the attitude towards these smaller nations, and Ukraine is not so small, it's seen under the auspices of the relationship with the other world power, and not described as a genuine element of Russian foreign policy in connection with these specific countries. When Germany started the deterrent policy, you mentioned it.
Yes.
Many in Europe, especially the Russians, perceived Germany as being a revisionist power, because we were not willing to recognize the borders at that time. And therefore, the Helsinki process was only possible after Germany decided and to guarantee that we would not change boundaries by force. This was the fundamental principle of deterrent. I think we cannot get a European peace order without Russians respecting the borders of its western neighbors and our eastern neighbors. This is a fundamental principle of the European order. And if we would make a compromise about that issue, we would again provoke the mistrust of all of our eastern neighbors and many people in the West again. Germany, for the first time for a couple of centuries, is surrounded by countries who are friends, want to become friends, or at least give the impression that they're friends. This is, without changing our geographic situation, the best geostrategic situation in which we are. Why do we have it? Because we have simply decided to take the interests of our smaller nations into consideration as well, and not only to pursue a big power policy. Traditionally, European policies were dominated by big power policies. Yalta, including the United States, before that, in the 19th century, Vienna Congress, France, Britain, Germany, Habsburg, and Russia, and later at the end of the 19th century, well, and with Yalta, without us. And now a friend of mine in Moscow said, we need a new Yalta, this time not about you, but with you. And I said, this is not an offer, this is a threat. Because we don't want a revival of the big power concept. Even if the Americans would try to do it, we would veto it. Because it's it's totally in contradiction to our, I must say, national interest. The only way how we can stabilize our relationship is by taking the interest of smaller nations into consideration. And when you look at the West European unification process, you look at the voting patterns in Parliament and the European Council, you can always see that smaller nations are overrepresented when you take only the number of inhabitants or the gross national product into consideration. Yes, in relative terms, yes. Otherwise, France and Germany together would have much more votes in the European Council or in the European Parliament. So big powers play a role in Europe, but stability is only there if smaller powers are so strong that the will of big powers cannot be imposed on them against their will. And this means, in this specific context, that when Germany is pursuing a policy towards Russia, which is basically always trying to be a cooperative approach, we will not be willing, as a result of our enlightened self-interest, to sacrifice the interest of the other smaller nations in between. We are always thinking about the interest of those countries as well. And especially we will not make a deal with the Russians about Ukraine without them saying yes. And again, if the United States would pursue such a course, we would veto it. And we have good reasons, and let me finally say that for that. Russia is the most important challenge, but sometimes also opportunity, east of the boundary of the European Union and NATO. It's not the most important partner east from us. The importance of the smaller nations as member of NATO and the European Union for us is so enormous inside these institutions that we would unravel these institutions if we would sacrifice the interest of the smaller nations. We have a lot of trade with Russia, but we have with Poland alone more trade than with Russia, and with the combined amount of those nations even more so. Which means, compared with earlier centuries, the very fundament of German-Russian relationship has changed. And the repetition of the old game of big power policy is no longer an element how we think and how we think we should pursue our national interest. And if Russia is still thinking in the terms of big power concept, on global level with the United States, on European level with a couple of players, they will not find a partner in Germany. And I think many people in Russia have not understood this game-changing element as a result of the events which took place after 91 and after the fall of the war and after the enlargement of the European Union, NATO. And I think this is something which we seriously need to debate with one another. Thank you.
Kirsten, thank you so much. And I thank you, I would say, even additionally, that you turned or redefine us from a small state to the small power. So for us as the Latvians, of course, it's good to hear that we are the power here in a whole, you can say, policy configuration. I am not completely sure about if I would fully agree, even though I think I would take this that small countries, small nations play an increasing role, but we still see the formats, G7, G20 in Hamburg, the Normandy format. Basically, we still see about bigger countries playing potentially the bigger role. But I agree, of course, it is in parallel. But my question is, exactly, so nations is one thing. The concept of perceiving each other, it's another thing, and very important elements to define. Perhaps I would go a little bit into criminology, asking about the leadership interaction among themselves. Do you think it matters how the leaders perceive each other? Because at least here in Latvia, in small power of Latvia, we see that Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin mildly said don't have the best chemistry. Does it have an influence on relationship? Or you would say that in German case, it's completely different prism how you look at things? Carsten?
They know one another. They understand one another. So they can calculate one another. That's a very profound and stable relationship between these two persons and these two powers. I think the politicians normally overestimate the role of personalities. And analysts normally underestimate the role of personalities. The two represent their countries and a specific worldview. And for us, the European Union is the first national priority. When it's challenged by Trump, it's seen as an hostile act. If it's challenged by Putin, it's even more seen as a hostile act. So the European Union is for us the core interest, as we define it, and we have that in mind when they two meet together. And I think this is a very sound basis, and I don't see that changing. I think that people love one another beyond that, respect one another beyond that. That's seldom in politics, but it happens. In the beginning, it was such of between the two. Then the Ukrainian crisis came in between. It changed their personal relationships, so politics had an impact on their personal relationship. And when you look at the statements, even of Steinmeier, and look at the statements of the present foreign minister, you see certain changes. A lot of people in Germany who were very pro-detente, like me, who always were and still am in favor of cooperating with Russia as much as possible, say the present policy of Russia is not a sound basis for such a cooperation. We will try to do what we can do, but we will not give up our principles. And we can make compromises, but we will not sacrifice our principles. If you expect that from us, there's a no-starter. I think this is, by the way, the personal chemistry between Angela Merkel and Trump was not so excellent either. And so in that sense.
Thank you, Carsten. Margarita, the Baltic perspective. Is it time to reconnect? Can we have a cooperational effort and even leading to detente at some sooner or later moment? Please.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, first of all, I'd like to thank Andres for bringing me to this wonderful panel already for the second time. It's a big honor. Thank you. Yes, I guess I'm going to speak from the position of a small country, but I'd like to take this discussion on to more philosophical level. And first of all, I disagree that the core problem of the Western and Russian relations is Ukraine. I think that there are a few more. And I'd like to come back to the discussion that we had in the morning about trust, because for me, it's a fundamental issue. For me, trust is a precondition of any effective and sustainable cooperation and relationship, be it interpersonal relation or relations between the client and the company, or the relations between two states or several states. Last year, during the security dialogue, we admitted that there is a lack of trust between Russia and the West, and that this lack of trust hampers the renewal of effective dialogue between two sides. Why this trust is lacking? And now I'm coming back to the discussion we had, and I believe that in this discussion we have seen that there are things that we see at some point, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we see fundamentally differently. Mr. Vyacheslav Trubnikov argued that the trust comes without the preconditions.
Margarita, Chatham House rules.
I'm sorry. So one of the colleagues argued that trust comes without the preconditions. So either you have it or you don't. But does it work like that? Because if you read it like that the trust is considered as emotion, it is not rationalized. Whereas for me, and I believe for many in the West, trust is not about the emotion. It's certain rationalization based on previous experiences. And when we say there is no trust, we mean that we do not have the rational preconditions proved by our experience for trust. So what are these preconditions for a small state? Or maybe not only for a small state, but for other states as well. First of all, respect to the international law, which is considered to serve as a guarantee, as a guardian, from the dangers of the anarchic international environment. Only with the working international law we can be safe. If you're a small nation or you're a big nation, probably as well. Second, integrity and predictability. You do what you say, and you do what is expected from you. And that's also important, because only then you can trust the person or the state in what it's saying or what it's doing. Non-interference into the internal affairs of sovereign states. That's very important for the small states, but we have seen in the previous month that even the bigger states and more powerful states also are having some problems with that. And unfortunately, during past several years, Russia has managed to undermine each of these preconditions. First of all, it has annexed the territory of the sovereign country, not so small country, but nevertheless, it does not hesitate to interfere into the political processes of the sovereign countries, not only small countries, as I already mentioned. And finally, it treats small countries rather as objects of international relations than the subjects. And we had another example during our discussion when Sweden was preached going closer to NATO, and it was told that, you know, some actions might follow. So I think that trust has certain preconditions, and if these preconditions are not fulfilled, there is no trust. That's natural. And if there is no trust, any cooperation would be rather superficial. You can say, okay, you can cooperate because you find common interests. But are those interests so common? Maybe they only the interest of today. Being a very strong admirer of the constructivism, I truly believe that the interest comes from values. And cooperation is only sustainable and effective when it's based on interests which are deriving from values. Can we say that we share the same values? And I live here.
Margarita, thank you. And as academic, or with my academic hat, I would gladly engage into the constructivist or post-constructivist or objectivist debate, but I think that it's not the place to debate in such a manner. But let's be as well realistic. I mean, we are, in many ways, we are different societies, different states with different ways of developing our, you can say, legitimacy of political leadership, and that should be accepted. Let's be realistic that there will not be either complete lack of trust or complete presence of trust. Always will be something in between, in a sense. And we are not living in a world of just absolute sort of good or bad, or white and black. So in these circumstances, when we are different, when we have sort of different scope of perception of what the presence or level of or depth of trust is, are there some fields where we still should look for cooperation? Or you would still say that we will look for this ultimate level scope of trust and only then we can build cooperation?
Of course, things which have to be dealt. I personally don't think that it makes sense to cooperate just for cooperation or talk to talk, but there are things which are necessary to be solved, and I think this all the risk reduction measures that we have been talking all day, these are important things, and these have to be brought to the table, because in this very sometimes insecure situation or unpredictable situation, we do not end up in a world which is more dangerous than it used to be. So this could be one pillar of cooperation. Another small issues where we already see certain progress, like 4 zones in Syria, maybe it could be ground for cooperation, just to make sure that these steps are enacted and it's working perfectly. Nuclear disarmament at some point, it was brought up today. It could be a starting point, but what can I see coming here already, not the first year, when people are asked for the potential issues of cooperation, they have less and less what to offer. So I believe the opportunities or possibilities for cooperation, unfortunately, and I say it heartedly, unfortunately, they have been shrinking. And they have been shrinking because there is a lack of trust. And we see that otherwise, if we do not trust each other, it's just talk to talk or walk to walk.
Thank you, Margarita. With this, I'm happy to open the floor. So we still have a half an hour of time for a Q&A session, for the questions and comments and for the discussion. Please, those of you who have some concrete question or comment, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and if you can identify a concrete person on the panel, it would be even more nice. So please, it would be nicer. Please, the floor is open. Yes.
Thank you for your very interesting discussion. My name is Alexey Veselый and I'm a journalist. Well, actually, I have a very simple question. First of all, it's about trust and also about sustainability. My question is how to build sustainable long-term relations between Russia and the West. And is it possible to build trust in such situation as now? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's have some additional questions. Yes. Artur, if there's nobody, you should ask.
Okay. Artur Zbekov, the student of the Registration University. And my question is, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Malganev said something about the Eurasian Economic Union. The question is, don't you think that this whole idea from Lisbon to Vladivostok that Mr. Putin have declared in 2011 isn't possible, mostly because the Eurasian Economic Union isn't capable to create a strong economically based union such as, for instance, European Union as it is? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think it also may go with the questions that now I think now recently in Russia we hear more and more from Shanghai to Kaliningrad. So the different kind of even space definition, how we would also look in that context. Some other questions, please? Yes, here.
Oleg Shlom, Embassy of Belarus. First of all, I totally agree with the idea of Helsinki 2 process, but for information, this idea is not new. It's been already voiced by Belarus some time ago. So what do you think about Belarus authorship of this idea? Secondly, if we are objective, we could probably blame other countries as well in interfering in sovereignty and internal situation of other countries. So if we want to be objective, then I think not only Russia but other countries could also be blamed. What do you think about that? And what about the role of the US, possible role of the US in settling the Ukrainian situation? Would it be crucial, or it could play a minor role? I mean, is it a role of the US?
Yeah, okay.
Would it be a crucial role, or would it be just a minor, or the US would not interfere at all in this situation?
Okay, thank you. So some other questions, or we can come back to the panels and we can have a second round of questions. So there are a couple of them. On trust, still the right circumstances. On Eurasian Economic Union and what is the space, and is there some commonality? Can we still build a common home from Vladivostok to Lisbon, or we start to think about some different already projects and competing ones? On a Belarusian role, on Belarusian presence in this whole debate, Helsinki 2, and also in US role, taking into account that actually US is even not part of Normandy format. So please, let's start with Artyom. You have not spoken for a while, and let's go through.
Okay, first.
And Artyom, if you still would like to also react, if panelists would like to react to what have been said by the previous panelists, of course, you have an opportunity.
Okay, I reserve the portion of to this trust question to my colleague from Lithuania. And when it comes to sustainability of Russia-West relations, and in general, the very existence of these relations in the lack of trust, it depends. Look at last 3 years. Sure, some of the countries, they're nearly frozen their relations with Russia, unfortunately. Among this portion of group of countries, our Baltic neighbors, or it was rather mutual process of freezing relations. But at the same time, some other countries, they used these 3 years and the lack of other competitive partners in Russian market, in Russian politics, to somehow to stress their role, to get additional room in Russian economy and in political relations. The French did like this. I can judge by St. Petersburg economic forums. The previous one, I mean in the year 2016 and in 2015, the biggest delegation were the French. And when I talked to French people from business and from politics, they explained it. They simply want to be the first while the rest somehow, somewhere, and absent from the Russian market. So even in the lack of, let us say, general trust, there is a room for maneuvering, there is a room for action, there is a room for separate, narrow, sometimes separatist interests. Then a Eurasian Economic Union and this quoting of this famous formula from Lisbon to Vladivostok, from somewhere to somewhere. I'm not going to comment this formula since not Mr. Putin who invented it. We've heard very often this formula from General Secretary Brezhnev and President Nixon. Then was another period of often repeated phrase in under Gorbachev in early 90s. As for Eurasian Economic Union, it's a reality. It's reality both for economic life in Russia, for internal market in Russia, as well as for markets in the member countries. So we, let us say, feel it on ourselves the results of this market. The Russian goods, they compete with the goods from these countries. We have no any more, let's say, autonomous, separate, for example, custom codes, but there is one unified custom code of the customs union. Sure, this union is weaker than the European Union simply because of the number of the countries involved, simply because of the bulk of economies united, and I guess no one, at least in nowadays, going to compete with the European Union, since you've invested more than 6 decades to build such a rich as European Union. The same was with socialist integration. The countries united under the leadership of the Soviet Union, under Comecon. They were weaker as economies, as was only one, let us say, engine there, the Soviet Union. And as for the European Union, there were at least at the beginning 2 engines, then the third one added, I mean, Britain, then Italy somehow recovered from the Second World War and 3 lost decades after the war. So as for, and last, I guess it should be reserved much more for Ambassador Charlie. As for U.S. role in Russia-Ukraine relations in settlement in Ukraine in general, I guess this role is going to be diminished more and more, simply because I can give you an explanation. Do we really care about conflicts in Latin America? Do we really ready to invest into appeasement of relations in a potential conflict of even really big, strong, weighty, beloved countries? Not so much, because the conflict lasts for more than 3 years. Yeah? We've already got used, and the United States got used to this conflict. It's first, and the second, they're too distant, and that is why their role is going to be diminished.
Thank you, Artyom. Alexander?
First of all, I want to react to the statement that European security crisis is not only Ukraine. It's possible to accept such idea, but Ukraine, it's a substantial reason, and without settlement of Ukrainian crisis, any restorations of sustainable architecture, European security, impossible. This is not my position, this is position of eminent person group of OSCE. We discuss a lot of it, it's our very clear conclusions. Now I want to comment 2 questions. First of all, trust, sustainable trust, it's possible or not. I think trust, this is results of dialogue, successful negotiation, successful cooperation. So, remember 1968, Czechoslovak events. Security situation in Europe in very deep crisis. But Genscher and his team in Germany was so brave and finished diplomacy that in 1969 put forward the idea of Dayton. Nobody believed. It was a lot of skepticism, but in 7 years we received Helsinki Act, who confirmed invisibility of European borders. So, to my mind, we're now in the same situation. A lot of people speak about Helsinki too, but on expert level, believe me, no one acting politician, not even now have a brave to speak about New Helsinki, but even about real dialogue with Russia. I visited the Munich conference in February. Everybody are ready to speak about dialogue only after Minsk implementation. But I once more stress, Minsk, it's about ceasefire. And even after 3 years, we not reach a ceasefire. And United States, I am 100% sure, without involvement of United States in Ukrainian sustainable settlement, impossible. Today, Minister Klimkin published article in the United States where very clearly gave message to the United States that Ukraine welcome And for two reasons. Because United States, key country who guarantee our territorial integrity according with our nuclear disarmament. It's a very serious question. Because somebody tell, okay, this is insurance, but this is assurance more stronger than legally binding agreements, but because the grounds of this is insurance, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And second, any Ukrainian settlement, any positive, negative, lead to new de facto security situation in Europe. United States cannot take into account the dramatic change in European security architecture. It's a vital, legitimate interest of United States. So to my mind, without very strong involvement of United States in final Minsk possible without United States. I stress once more, ceasefire, maybe not necessary that the United States participate in Minsk. But even this is ceasefire with the United States not work. But when we speak about settlement, peaceful formula, sustainable for Ukraine and for Europe's security, it's impossible totally without the United States.
Yeah, I join you for European security because it's possible.
Kristen?
The United States is not a member of the European Union, but it's a European power. And if they want to play a role, they will play a role, hopefully constructive. If not, we have to debate it with them inside the alliance. And I think there is a slightly contradictory attitude of the Russians on that aspect. On the one side, they want a bilateral, strong relationship with the United States. On the other side, they see a strong role of the United States in that part of Europe with some suspicion. And I think this is an element of ambivalence which always has been there. I have, and there I'm not sure whether I agree with you. I think that a lot depends on the calculation of what success means on the Russian side. The Russians, Putin is saying that this event in Ukraine, this war, was a success. I read it otherwise. I think that, I mean, it sounds cynical what I'm now saying. The Russians got control over military bases in Ukraine, which nobody challenged, and which they had before anyhow. They are now controlling parts of eastern Ukraine, which strategically play no importance. It costs them. To imagine that Ukraine or we will pay for the reconstruction is an illusion. So they are in, like in Syria, but it's difficult to get out. And we will only have help if they live up to certain principles and commitments. On the other side, Ukraine is, unlike Putin meant, becoming a nation. Putin made a statement when he annexed Crimea that he respected Ukraine as a state, but not as a nation. They were small Russians. He didn't say that, but that's what he meant. And all Russian speakers were anyhow part of the Russian Mir, Ruski Mir. What you see now, and I'm relatively often, not only in Moscow, but also in Kiev, is nation-building process under anti-Russian auspices. And you increasingly find people who earlier spoke Russian, who now speak Ukrainian, and you find especially young people who speak Russian and identify themselves, even in Eastern Ukraine, and the figures are very obvious, as Ukrainians. So this is a process going on. Does it mean that Russia is winning? They are winning, have won the military battle. That's why the Minsk agreement was necessary. They were winning on the ground. They have lost trust in Western Europe. They have lost a partner in Germany. Germany was in favor of modernizing, helping in the modernization of Russia. We don't see a possibility to help in the modernization of a country which doesn't want to modernize, in many respects, economically and culturally. So I don't see, in strategic sense, Russia winning. As long as Putin has a different view, it's difficult to make with him a compromise. So I think the conflict will last for a certain period. But does it mean that this is a Russian success story? When you look at all the consequences, I have my doubts. And I know that many analysts in Russia have similar doubts as I have. And I'm saying that now I come to the final point is on cooperation and trust. When I went to Iran, I asked for a release of a couple of Jews. Next time I came, thank you very much. 2 are released, 2 are dead. Did I have trust? Very limited. When I first came to Moscow, I knew as a youngster that they were trying to infiltrate my social democratic youth organization. Does it mean that I stopped cooperation? No. My trust at that time was limited. So I do not, if diplomats only cooperate and try to cooperate, increase the spectrum of possible cooperation, and when they love one another, when they have no conflicts, we could limit our diplomatic activities very much. Therefore, cooperation is not a reward, it's an element of strategy. And there I differ from many people in the West who think that cooperation is reward. It's not a reward for good behavior, it's a strategy to change the behavior of the other side, and they try to change you. And therefore, I think at the same time, to cooperate with Russia where it's useful for both sides and where it's possible, it's limited in scope, and at the same time to protect yourself against certain risk, they will also protect themselves against perceived risk, is for the future, the next alternative is a strategy. There was a time after 1991 where it was about the combination of cooperation and integration. Now it's about selective cooperation plus protection against risk. And this will take time before that is changing again in a more positive direction.
Thank you, Karsten. Margarita.
A lot of things have been answered already, so well, I'm just going to tackle this trust issue and a bit on Ukraine. Is it possible to rebuild trust in this given situation? Nothing is impossible. Yes, of course possible. What are preconditions for the trust? I think, first of all, is humbleness, probably on both sides, admitting things which went wrong, and things which we have done wrong. So that could be the first step. Willingness to cooperate, but it should come from the heart, not from the mouth. Because when one day you hear the words of in sort of supporting cooperation, and these words are not supported by the deeds or the real actions, then it diminishes the threat. Certain degree of predictability also, that would be quite useful for increasing the trust. So I believe it's possible. It just, yeah, it's a matter of how one behaves and how one wishes to rebuild this trust. Talking about Ukraine, just one observation. Well, I very much subscribe to what Karsten said, and I also envision the solution of the Ukrainian issue in a broader terms, not only just the solution of the Eastern Ukrainian crisis, but in terms of building the strong institutions in Ukraine and going through the reforms, helping Ukrainians to go through the reforms, and helping them to be successful, progressive, democratic country. So I think that this is the most important issue, because otherwise, I mean, you solve one issue, but if people are unhappy, and we heard from our colleague from Ukraine that people are unhappy, we can see another possibilities to disturb this country, and the solution probably would be nothing. And yeah.
Thank you, Margarita. Thank you, panelists. And we go for another round, the last round, the second and last round, please. Yes, Emmett.
Thank you very much. Emmett Toohey from the Estonian Center of Eastern Partnership. Just wanted to ask the panelists what you thought the prospects for cooperation were on energy security. The panel asks us whether it's time to reconnect, but of course both Russia and the West are already connected through a web of gas and oil pipelines and of course electricity connections that we've inherited from the Soviet period. This applies, of course, to all of the panelists because both Ukraine's future as a transit state may be endangered, thanks in part to plans supported by Germany, something that all of your smaller neighbors do not support, such as Nord Stream 2 and Opal, for example. Thank you.
Yes, please. Yep.
Jurgita Binkiene, Embassy of Lithuania Consul. I was listening to you all and was thinking, isn't it a little bit obsolete thinking and talking purely in national terms? Because you know that I heard about diplomatic cooperation. Diplomats do not cooperate governments. Diplomats are only executives. And governments are under, today's governments are under enormous pressure of international corporations. So economic interest and interest of well-being rule. I see as consul many international marriages. So people are melting and boundaries are disappearing. We want that or not? Perhaps we do not want. As a Lithuanian coming from a small state, perhaps I do not want to see that, but it's coming. So perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's time to think for the future. Perhaps younger generations, young people are thinking a little bit otherwise, in more, I don't like that word, global, but it is like this, in global terms. And people are mixing, ideas are mixing, and way of living are mixing. So it's just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, I think, the human dimension as well. We should just all intermarry and everything will be solved in this case. But no, I think it is a very important point. And of course, my humorous addition to this is not to undermine the, I think exactly, it's not just about the governments. There is a different dimensions of interconnection. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Alexander Alge, Ambassador of Greece. One minor remark on the so-called selective memory. You referred about the golden so-called rule of 3 years, all the conflicts. I have to say sorry, but we remember always the minor conflicts. The fact that the Baltic countries got their independence, we never forgot the fact that for tactics, they could not in a position to raise or to put forward their case always, does not mean that the national community forgot about. I remember the 60s, 70s, at school, we always used to speak on top. On a part of that, it is I believe strongly on the small countries, the power they have to demonstrate, because they have more flexibility and adaptability than bigger countries. So anyway, it is one thing if we put forward, and second, if we forget. About the recognition of nation and countries, yes, it is a lot of substance behind that. In the case of the Skopje, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, one neighbor countries recognized it as a state, but not as a nation. What does it mean? It's for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And if there are no any, so there is still additional one? Yes, please. So we'll have a chance for a
Thank you very much. My name is Vladimir Sblagdaros. I'm a young politologist from Latvia. So I have 3 questions for Mr. Question for Mr. Malgin.
All 3 questions for one person?
No, for a couple. If not a Minsk agreement, then from your perspectives, what will be this instrument of the Ukrainian question, how to solve it? And for the Mr. Charlie, Ukrainian government today banned a couple of social networks of Russia. What do you think? Is it so necessary from a perspective of international relations to do such a step. And for Dr. Sheshelgaita, sorry, about this trust in international relations between countries. Do you think, I just comment, sorry for my comment, I think it's a trap when you're thinking about the trust in international relations, because from my perspective, there are only interests. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to give the floor, last but not least, to President, the President Valdis Zatlers, I think, who was very instrumental in cooperative efforts between Latvia and Russia, and was author and the main participant of the very historical trip to Moscow in 2010 in December, when we had a really high hopes about the detente and interaction and engagement.
7 years ago.
Yes, 7 years ago. Please.
Thank you very
President.
much for giving me the floor. You know, already 7 years have passed since that nice period of history. I would like to point out two points. The first one, I would not hurry with Helsinki process too, because the first one, it will be successful if everybody is prepared for that. Are we prepared? I would say not. The second point, I would hesitate to call this process Helsinki 2, because by annexation of Crimea and intervention into Ukraine, Helsinki was not respected. So let's not make another document, another process, because the first one was not respected, and I must say it failed. The second point is why we should not hurry. We should not interfere in the internal affairs of Russia. But we have to understand, and as already was mentioned before, that many things have to change in Russia itself, in the society. And at present moment, when Russia is in a perception that everybody is against Russia, which is not true, it's very difficult to really come to some kind of global or European or pan-Euro-Asian process of peace, because we need it, but I would not hurry with that. I would talk about that, but not say that will happen tomorrow. And Minsk is a very bad word for any processes. Remember in Minsk about Karabakh, remember Minsk about Ukraine, and you understand, you know, that it's again, maybe let's not use Minsk as a perception of all solutions.
Thank you, President. Thank you for your insight. And we go back to the panel, and let's start in reverse order with Margarita, and then we go through the panel. Please, Margarita.
A couple of remarks. First of all, on the human dimension of security, I think that in this respect, we had taught a lot about the state security, about the security on the state level. And since the state retains the monopoly of violence, many of the security issues would be decided at the state level. But coming back to the human dimension, and here I come back to trust. I think more trust could be generated by increasing people-to-people contact with Russians. I don't have problem trusting Russians as the society. I think that they are great. But it's when we are talking about the mistrust, we're talking about the government level. So these people-to-people contact could be one of the preconditions to build the trust, which is almost non-existent at the moment. And another question goes to the student who was challenging my comments on trust. So I think it's a matter of perspective. I'm taking this more liberal, constructivist view of the international society. You are thinking more on this Machiavellian realist terms. But for the small country, which I'm coming from, I think that the world in which countries are behaving or basing their behavior only on the interest is a very dangerous world. And there are very good examples when states were basing their behavior on the altruism and brought some changes about that. And when I have to give an example of the nice gesture on the area, on the sphere of international politics, I always remember small Iceland, who didn't have a particular interest in 90s being the first country to recognize Lithuanian independence. It's a small gesture, not related to the state interest, but it makes a great change after all. Do Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia have a lot of interest on supporting Georgia, Ukraine? Maybe a bit, but I don't think it's behavior based purely on the interest. There's something more behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. Karsten, I think you are next in a row.
First, I would not ask for a new charter. We have Helsinki, which is brilliant, and we have the Charter of Paris, which is even better. The Soviet Union did sign the Charter of Paris as well. Russia did not, because it was already in the early 90s. But they have not withdrawn the signature. They have acted against, but not withdrawn it. If we now would start negotiation about a new charter, they would not be better, but worse. Therefore, I'm against new negotiations about that. Second, about people-to-people contact. We have roughly between 2 and 3 million people who emigrated from the former Soviet Union to Germany after '89. Russian Germans, mixed marriages, Russian Jews, and so on and so on. You find them everywhere. So we have an enormous amount of society contact. Some problems, but minor problems. And I think that it gives us, with all the people-to-people exchange, which is related, a certain stability of our relationship. And naturally, there are also people among them, sometimes they are used by Russian TV, who make statements as Germans with Russian background who are directed against German politics. Is that for us a threat? No. We take this as a given and say, by the way, I hope you allow the same diversification inside your debate, which is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. But all these society contexts, we will lose on the one and the other side. But in general terms, the more pluralism, the better it is for us. And I think, therefore, it's very important in culture terms and all the other terms, but also in terms of context, parliamentary context. The role of Russian parliamentarians is different from the role of German parliamentarians, to put it that way. But why shouldn't they have contact with one another? And we have had a meeting, I was part of the organizers, between Russian parliamentarians, American parliamentarians, and German parliamentarians in a specific situation, and some think tank people. Russian think tanks who naturally had a different role than German think tanks. First day, it was only about accusing one another. Then they went to Silo, short of Berlin, where there were the last big battles where the Soviet army conquered Berlin. We went there together, and then emotions. It was about emotions and history. And then it was about whether one could do something in the future. I think such an individual event, like our conference here, cannot change the big picture. But they are needed, especially when you have a situation in which a Russian leadership is, to put it that way, is not open to broad advice from a lot of people. Their advice is limited to small circles, as far as we know. And people with a critical view are not overrepresented. And therefore, this type of contact is also an element of giving them some reality test about the outside world. By the way, Trump needs it as well. So it's not a limited problem in so far as Russia is concerned. And I fear sometimes they believe their own propaganda in TV. We have seen that in other occasions as well. And therefore, I think that we should not fear communication. We should not fear cooperation. We should really analytically see where it is to the advantage of both sides. or only one side, then it will not take place, but both sides. And then whether one can start building something on it. I think this will be a long, long process. You are totally right. It will be a long process. We are in a deep crisis. But if we want to solve it in a couple of years and to diminish the risks which are now existing, we have to start now with the dialogue, with the contact, and the mutual testing of our concepts.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Carsten. Alexander?
My position that it's more easier to continue confrontation, especially for practical politicians, than to be so brave to start Dayton. It's more easier to be eagle than to be pigs. So I am not agree with your Mr. President. Excuse me, please. I very respect you. In 1969, no one country in the world, in Europe, was prepared for Dayton and was prepared for Helsinki I. Even in 1974. And before Helsinki I, and even after Helsinki I, Soviet Union illegally annexed Baltic states. But it's not prohibited to successfully to finish Helsinki process. If you don't like term Helsinki II, and I agree with you concerning the Minsk, maybe let's call a new process Riga Dialogue Plus.
Very good.
Because you have a very constructive dialogue. Yeah. And I want to tell you very important things. We now not put idea of reconciliation or Dayton. And practically we construct every day a new Berlin Wall in the eastern part of Ukraine. And your question concerning the today prohibition of Russian media or sites, or for example, 2 months ago, economic blockade from Ukraine to, because we not put positive ideas, we follow the construction of new Berlin Wall. We have 2 scenarios. I call to return to Cold War scenario to construct a new Berlin Wall, or I called cold peace scenario when we, through Dayton, to reunify Ukrainian territorial integrity and permit to reconstruct European united architecture, cooperative architecture. So to my mind, I have a dream that maybe a new old Angela Merkel, or maybe Mr. Macron, or maybe because Mr. Putin never appealed for Dayton. Not because he don't want Dayton. He wants Dayton very much. Because he knows when he tell it, everybody in the West, especially in the United States, tell it's a very bad idea because this is Putin idea. So we need a brave Western politician in power who really put as a crucial idea New Dayton. If you, maybe another word, maybe reconnection. But without positive policy, positive approach, we continue to build a new Berlin Wall.
Thank you, Alexander.
Yeah. I completely agree with Alexander, and I will simply add, answering some questions. First, Minsk, it's purely instrumental issue. Insulated, instrumental, necessary to some extent, but if we achieve ceasefire in a other possible different way, it also works. Then, sure, Helsinki is about process, new architecture, new settlements in Europe, not about the notion and the name Helsinki. It could somehow derive from OSCE. It could be organized anew. It could be organized as it was CFE treaty somehow in parallel, but it's about process of general involvement of all European countries and non-European as US and Canada, but those who are, let's say, politically European countries. Then, by the way, it's a good idea to use Riga, since Riga have not been used in connotation with peace treaties since Riga peace treaty that somehow formed this part of Europe and somehow guaranteed stability there at least for about 15 years. Then as for those who could initiate this dialogue. Here I also agree with Ambassador that it should not be a Russian leader. Once we tried, after the previous conflict, I mean 2008, this Evian speech. Once I will tell you the whole story, how it's appeared, its idea somehow appeared before the conflict. But fortunately, the very conference was somehow agreed much before and happened after the conflict. It was a good pretext, but badly used by those who heard this speech and those who have not reckoned down. There were our own mistakes, how we started developing the idea for the document which looked absolutely outdated. As for the Russian attitude towards Ukraine inside the country, both society and elite becomes more and more, let's say, divided, fragmented mosaic when it comes to Ukraine. It's not 2014. It's not anymore period of mobilization and consolidation over Ukrainian issue. Now Ukraine is seen very much differently by different parts of ruling. Here says ruling, it's not about opposition, ruling elite. As it was seen, for example, in the years 2012, 2013, from one hand, we've heard about how bad that Ukraine goes to closer association with EU. From another hand, Russian state-run banks and corporations somehow tried to anchor in the Ukrainian economy to be together with Ukraine within association with the European Union. Unfortunately, they didn't declare it. Unfortunately, Russian business elite and those who are inside ruling political elite, very often they're too shy to put forward healthy ideas that know their heads.
Thank you, Artyom. Thank you for all the panelists for, I think, the thought-provoking and food for thought, whatever you define it, ideas and insights for the debate. Of course, if I am very positive, I can say, excellent, we have Riga Dialogue Plus process, and soon there will be the Riga Treaty as well, the Riga Peace Treaty, the Riga Peace Agreement.
Why not?
Why not? I mean, this is, of course, one of the intentions of each capital to some extent. At the same time, I think, let's be realistic, we are in a long process. I think we are in a very challenging environment, and if we still should define, and what we also defined today in our discussions, that it seems that it's still more glass half empty than glass half full. And if we speak about new normal, let's hope that this new normal is more characterized by managed confrontations and by risks of unmanaged confrontations. We are different in many ways. We have different interests, we have different visions, we are different societal, developmental, political animals, if you may say so. Of course, it doesn't mean that we should not look forward. I think that after 2008, as it was mentioned also here, there are some openings for the further discussion, because in the midst of the political cycle, I think it's sort of difficult. After the parliaments, presidents are being elected, at some moment, I think the people can also start to discuss. It doesn't mean that we should not discuss already now, but I think there should be some expectations management as well. We speak more about selective engagement, and emphasis, I think, here at the moment is still about selective, and let's hope that it will be soon more comprehensive or later comprehensive engagement. And I really liked also what Karsten said. I mean, all what panelists said, but Karsten always provides some interesting ideas, what at least catch very much my eye and ear. Last time you mentioned cooperation as far as possible, security as far as necessary. This time you said cooperation, it is a strategy actually to change each other, to change the other side. And I think that cooperation as such, it is an instrument in many ways, sort of, which is a part of the wider picture. So with this, you can draw also your own conclusions on what side of pessimism or optimism we are, but I still like to repeat another part of the region. You know, the pessimist is who says that well, it's very bad. The optimist says it can get even worse. So thanks to the audience for coming here, for joining us in such a large numbers. It means that there is certainly an interest in the discussion. Absolutely, there must be an interest because it touches upon us and it touches upon lives of the people also here in the region. Thanks once more to the partner institutions. I can name this sites: Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Nuclear Threat Initiative, European Leadership Network, German Marshall Fund, Black Sea Trust, and also business entity, Latvia's Dzelzceļš or Latvian Railways. So I think this Riga dialogue is a process. This is just one part of the process. It's a wider one, and we hope that at some moment there will be the Riga Peace Treaty. But thank you to the speakers, and let me join the last round of applause. But before that,